Right now, as you lie in the deepening stillness of your room, you might be carrying a very specific, invisible weight that leaves you feeling profoundly isolated, even when surrounded by people who care for you. It is a heavy, numb stillness located directly in the center of your chest. A polite but immovable glass wall that you have quietly built between your heart and the rest of the world. Maybe you came here tonight because you are utterly exhausted from living in a state of permanent self-exile. You smile, you listen, and you function perfectly during the day. Yet the moment someone attempts to truly know you, or the moment an opportunity for genuine closeness arises, a freezing panic takes root in your throat. You find yourself preemptively pulling back, creating a safe distance, or retreating into solitude before anyone else can have the chance to blindside you with pain. You have learned to treat loneliness as a necessary price for safety, hiding behind a shield of absolute self-reliance because your memory tells you that vulnerability is a structural flaw. Let your physical body settle completely into the deep, unhurried support of your bed, allowing the surface beneath you to assume the massive work of holding your weight. The room around you is softly dissolving into shadow now, the loud, critical voices of the daylight hours finally fading away from your awareness. Feel the gentle, reassuring weight of your blanket as it wraps around you, creating a quiet sanctuary where your heart can rest without needing to defend itself. Outside your window, a soft sliver of silver moonlight filters through the cool night air, casting long, peaceful shapes across your pillow without demanding anything from the dark. The distant, muted sounds of the waking world are slowing down, passing by like water under a bridge. With each slow, natural rise and fall of your chest, invite the tight muscles around your ribcage to begin their softening, letting go of the exhausting vigilance required to maintain an invisible wall in the dark. Dear friend, right now, please let these words settle into your tired mind. You are not broken. What you are experiencing tonight, this habit of keeping everyone at a safe distance, this sudden urge to retreat when someone offers you unconditional warmth, is not a failure of your spirit. This deep pattern of emotional self-exile is actually a highly intelligent, deeply sensitive defense mechanism that your mind constructed long ago to protect your softest places after a devastating loss or a bitter betrayal. It was born from a noble desire to ensure you would never be caught off guard by sorrow again. But tonight we will not force your mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you violently shatter your defenses before you are ready to sleep. We are not here to judge the walls you built to survive. Tonight, we are simply going to learn how to hold this isolation differently, discovering that you can rest without needing to seal yourself away from life. We often live under the illusion that absolute isolation is the only true guarantee of emotional safety. The mind constantly whispers that if you remain entirely self-contained, polite, and unreached, you can never be wounded again. But this total containment holds a profound and exhausting paradox. The mind does not find genuine peace because you have successfully kept out the rain. It finds peace when it realizes that the very seal you use to protect your heart is what is turning your inner world into stagnant dust. Your habit of self-exile is not proof that you are fundamentally unlovable. It is fear pretending to protect you by keeping you empty. It is like a heavy, salt-glazed stoneware preservation jar fired with an unyielding, vitrified mineral glaze. Because its seal is absolute, it keeps out every drop of external dampness and winter rain, but the air inside remains completely dry, stale, and empty of living moisture, turning its internal contents to brittle dust, while the outside world undergoes a beautiful, changing spring thaw. The salt-glazed jar remains frozen in its own protective enclosure, maintaining its rigid, impervious boundaries, because it believes that any exposure to the dampness of the world will cause it to shatter completely. Have you felt this cold, stagnant dryness within your own chest tonight? Have you been moving through your relationships with your spirit, held so far back behind a glass wall that you have forgotten what it feels like to breathe in unison with another human being? We spend our precious energy maintaining a flawless, self-contained exterior, treating every offer of deep intimacy as an emergency we must escape, only to find that our fortress has become our deepest prison. If it feels right, take a slow, unhurried breath in through your nose, simply noticing the cool, clean quality of the night air as it travels down to meet the heavy stillness within your chest. And when you are ready, let that breath slip away through your lips with a long, soft, unrestricted sigh, letting your shoulders drop and your abdomen loosen into the pillow. There is no need to force your breathing to mimic an artificial rhythm. Just let your body breathe itself in the dark. You do not need to figure out how to open your heart completely before you are allowed to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. You are safe enough right now to let the heavy shield soften, and to remember that absolutely nothing is required of you in this quiet room. One of the great liberating insights of the Buddha was the understanding that true emotional safety does not come from building an unyielding wall against an impermanent, changing world, but from discovering the boundless, non-reactive space of your own awareness. The Buddha pointed out that when we try to create an artificial permanence by freezing ourselves in isolation, we do not escape suffering, we multiply it. We mistake the cold safety of the fortress for genuine peace, forgetting that the heart requires the living moisture of connection to remain supple and alive. When we realize that our true nature is not a fragile vessel that must be hidden away, but the wide open sky that can allow all the changing tides of human relationships to pass through without being destroyed, the need for exile naturally begins to dissolve. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the hidden cost of an armored heart. We will journey to a silent, frosted plum-orchard storehouse during a bone-chilling autumn fog, where an old temple potter showed a very isolated young man exactly what happens to a vessel that refuses to breathe with the changing seasons. But before we travel to that misty orchard workshop, let your jaw soften slightly. Separate your teeth, release the small, tired muscles around the corners of your eyes, and allow your head to sink fully into the support of your pillow, letting go of the struggle as we begin to listen. Deep within the northern valleys, where the mountain shadows elongated early each afternoon, the autumn fog rolled across the landscape like a thick, silent wave of grey wool. The air was bone-chilling, smelling of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, bitter scent of frost-bitten wood. Nestled in the center of a silent, frosted plum orchard stood a low-roofed stone storehouse, its cedar timbers darkened by decades of exposure to the mountain mist. Water dripped with a rhythmic, hollow click from the bare, blackened branches of the plum trees, landing softly on the stiffened grass below. Inside this storehouse, the cold was profound and motionless. This was the workspace of Yuji, a young village potter who had quietly severed his ties with the community below following a sudden, devastating grief that had shattered his youth. He had retreated to this isolated orchard, wrapping himself in an impenetrable armor of quiet, efficient labor, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and treating every human interaction as a danger to be avoided. Yuji had thrown his entire existence into the mastery of high-fire ceramics, working under the distant, non-judgmental guidance of an elderly master potter named Jian. Master Jian was a man of immense silence, whose hands were permanently grey with the dried residue of river clay, and whose eyes held the spacious clarity of a mountain lake. Yuji did not seek Jian's companionship, he sought his technical secrets. Yuji had become obsessed with creating a very specific type of pottery vessels that were subjected to such extreme, punishing temperatures in the kiln that the clay completely vitrified, its minerals melting together until the walls turned into a dense, non-porous glass. Yuji prided himself on the absolute unyielding density of his work. He would hold up his finished pieces and boast to himself that nothing from the outside world could ever penetrate them, no moisture, no acid, no stain, and no warmth. He believed with a fierce and desperate conviction that if he could make his own heart as vitrified and impervious as his stoneware, he would never have to experience the agony of unexpected shattering again. On this particular morning, the late autumn fog was so dense it pressed against the small wooden shutters of the storehouse, dimming the daylight into a pale silver dusk. Yuji sat at his wooden wheel, his body hunched tightly forward, his shoulders raised to block out the chill. His hands were raw and red from the cold slip, working with a frantic, rigid precision to shape yet another heavy wall of clay. He was operating from that familiar, numb stillness in his chest, his mind moving through the day behind a thick glass pane of self-imposed isolation. He told himself he was perfectly safe up here, high above the vulnerabilities of the valley, completely contained within his own unyielding discipline. Master Jian walked slowly into the storehouse, his footsteps making no sound against the packed earthen floor. He carried an old bamboo basket containing a few dried twigs for the small charcoal brazier, his movements calm and entirely integrated with the quiet architecture of the room. He did not comment on Yuji's rigid posture, nor did he praise the flawless shape of the damp vessel turning on the wheel. Instead, he stopped in the dark, forgotten corner of the storehouse, where the shadows were deepest and the air was most stagnant. He reached down and lifted a heavy, ancient object that had sat undisturbed for many winters, placing it deliberately on the wooden bench right beside Yuji's spinning wheel. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the hidden cost of an absolute fortress. Yuji slowed his wheel to a halt, wiping the grey clay slip from his knuckles with a coarse rag. He looked at the object Jean had brought forward. It was a massive salt-glazed stoneware preservation jar, its exterior coated in a thick, pitted mineral glaze that shimmered with a dull, orange-peel texture under the dim light. The jar was capped with an exceptionally thick, unyielding clay lid, which had been sealed shut years ago with a dense rim of hardened wax. The vessel was entirely cold to the touch, heavy and completely separate from the moist, foggy air that filled the rest of the room. It looked like an immovable monument to total containment. "UG," Master Jian said, his voice a low, spacious resonance that seemed to grow directly out of the stone floor. This jar was crafted by an ancestor of mine during a season of great scarcity. He intended to preserve the finest plums from this orchard, sealing them away so that no dampness, no rot, and no external air could ever reach them. He believed that by creating an absolute barrier against the changing elements, he could keep the fruit pristine forever. "I want you to open it today." Yuji frowned, his chest tightening slightly. As he looked at the unyielding lid, he took a heavy iron wedge and a wooden mallet, placing the metal edge against the hardened wax rim. With a series of sharp, echoing strikes, he chipped away the protective seal, his muscles straining against the stubborn resistance of the clay. The mallet blows sounded loud and abrasive in the silent storehouse, vibrating through Yuji's arms and down into his stomach. Finally, with a dull, scraping groan, the unyielding lid broke free from the mouth of the stoneware jar. Yuji leaned forward, expecting to find the rich, sweet aroma of preserved fruit, or perhaps the dark moisture of an ancient vintage. But as the lid was lifted, no scent emerged. He looked down into the deep, dark interior of the salt-glazed jar. There was no liquid, no texture, and no life. Resting at the very bottom of the vessel was nothing but a small, pathetic mound of bone-grey dust and a few brittle, shriveled black pits that broke into powder at the slightest vibration of the air. Because the jar had been sealed with such absolute rigidity, denying the interior contents any access to the natural flow of air, the changing seasons, or the living moisture of the atmosphere, the fruit had not been preserved. It had quietly starved within its own fortress, suffocating in its own stagnant air until its organic structure had withered into lifeless, dry dust. Yuji sat entirely motionless on his stool, his hand still gripping the heavy iron wedge, the cold autumn fog swirling around his boots. A sudden, piercing wave of emotional recognition flared deep within his chest, shattering the numb, protective stillness he had maintained for years. He stared at the grey powder at the bottom of the impervious jar, and for the first time he saw the terrifying blueprint of his own chosen life. He had built his self-exile exactly like this salt-glazed vessel. He had vitrified his boundaries and sealed his heart with the dense wax of absolute self-reliance, believing that by keeping out the unpredictable dampness of human relationships, he was preserving his life. But as he looked at the dry dust, he realized that his fortress was not protecting his soul, it was quietly suffocating it, turning his inner world into a stagnant, sterile vault where no joy, no warmth, and no true peace could ever survive. Master Jean gently reached out his grey-stained hand and touched the rough rim of the open jar, his dark eyes reflecting the pale silver light of the orchard. "You see, the old potter whispered, his voice holding the tender gravity of an unhurried spring rain. The jar survived the winters without a single crack, but everything inside it died from a lack of breath. You have turned your own spirit into this salt-glazed wall. You think that by remaining completely unreached and polite behind your glass barriers, you are winning the battle against sorrow. But true life requires the courage to be porous. It requires the willingness to breathe with the fog, to soften with the season, and to allow the world to touch you, even if it means risking the occasional rot. If you never let the moisture in, you do not remain safe. You simply turn to dust in the dark." Yuji dropped the iron wedge onto the dirt floor, his breathing finally breaking out of his upper chest, expanding downward into his abdomen with a long, trembling shudder. He did not speak, and he did not attempt to clean up the dust that had spilled onto the bench. He simply sat in the quiet storehouse, letting the cold, damp autumn air enter his lungs without trying to push it away, recognizing the profound emptiness of his victory. Master Jian did not force him to return to the wheel, nor did he offer him a list of instructions on how to change. He simply picked up his basket of twigs and walked back out into the frosted plum orchard, leaving the heavy stoneware jar open to the grey sky, its unyielding lid resting face up on the oak bench. Now, let the image of that silent, frosted storehouse and the opened salt-glazed jar sink deeply into the quiet spaces of your own awareness tonight. Feel the profound resonance of that moment of recognition, letting it touch the hidden glass walls you have been maintaining around your own heart. You do not have to force yourself to become completely open or vulnerable to the world in this single hour. You can simply notice the heavy, dry cost of your own self-protection, allowing your mind to rest from its long, exhausting work of guarding the fortress, as we prepare to look closer at the nature of this inner winter. This story is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding, or detached like the frost-bitten stone blocks that line the orchard ravine. It is not an invitation to live a pale, colorless life where you no longer care about your work, nor does it mean you must look at those you love with an empty, distant indifference. Buddhist wisdom does not wish to turn your highly sensitive, deeply perceptive heart into a flat piece of vitrified glass where nothing can reach you. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a profound and gentle way of occupying your own life that does not require you to wear down your own spirit in a desperate, continuous attempt to prevent the world from breaking you. When we observe Yuji's deep distress in the silent storehouse, we begin to discover that his true suffering did not live in the simple fact that he had experienced a devastating grief, or that the clay required a firm hand to shape. A past hurt is a painful reality. It is a natural, heavy condition of a vulnerable human life. The real suffocating suffering began the exact moment his own mind translated that initial wound into a permanent, lifelong command to remain entirely hidden. It was the internal rigid resistance within his own thoughts that insisted he must freeze his boundaries into a state of absolute non-porous density, believing that if he allowed a single drop of external warmth or intimacy to enter his chest, he would be instantly destroyed. In our own lives, we often slide into this exact same trap without ever realizing the immense, hidden toll it takes on our bodies. We mistake the exhausting numbness of chronic self-exile and hyper-independence for a necessary form of wisdom. We tell ourselves that because we have been blindsided by betrayal or loss in the past, we must never let our guard down again. When a pocket of genuine peace arrives, or when someone offers us unconditional care, our throat tightens instantly. The mind panics and immediately begins to build a high wall, looking for the hidden catch, waiting for the illusion to shatter. We believe that by keeping our expectations low and rejecting closeness before it can complicate our lives, we are protecting ourselves from pain, forgetting that this continuous self-exile is the very thing that is keeping us dry and empty. One of the great liberating insights of the Buddha was the translation of this frantic, internal gripping into a clear understanding of how we create our own inner winter. In simple emotional language, what the tradition calls attachment is not a healthy love for life. It is that tight, desperate feeling that says, things must remain completely fixed and predictable, and I must never be vulnerable, or I cannot be okay. Craving becomes the anxious pull that turns a moment of quiet connection into a terrifying emergency, forcing us to constantly retreat into our shells before we can be abandoned. We become addicted to the habit of isolation, using our emotional numbness not to heal our lives, but as an iron door to keep the living water of the universe from reaching our parched roots. When we look through this lens, mindfulness ceases to be a cold, academic concept and becomes the sacred ability to see a wave of freezing panic rise in your body without immediately jumping behind your glass pane to hide from it. It is the capacity to notice that heavy, numb stillness in your chest, to feel the tight pull in your throat, and to say to your own mind, I see this old fear of being hurt, but I do not have to obey its command to run away. Awareness is the vast, quiet space that can observe an isolated, defensive thought passing through your consciousness without believing that you are the fortress. It allows you to see that your feelings of detachment are simply old, protective weather patterns moving across the wide landscape of your mind, not the solid truth of who you are. Slowly, the teaching becomes deeply personal. Think of how this invisible mechanism is operating within your own body right now, as you lie in the quiet darkness of this room. What kind gestures, deep conversations, or small moments of emotional warmth have you quietly backed away from recently, out of a subconscious fear that they would eventually bring you sorrow? What unspoken distances are you currently maintaining in your relationships, or what walls are you already trying to fortify before tomorrow comes? Notice how your body continues to maintain its defensive stance, your muscles slightly braced, your breathing restricted to your upper ribs, as if you are still sitting in that frozen stone storehouse, trying to seal your heart with a thick rim of protective wax. Notice that the room around you is completely safe, yet your mind is still vibrating with the friction of an old betrayal that lives only in your memory. Buddhist wisdom reminds us of the beautiful, comforting truth of impermanence, the understanding that every heavy emotion, every old scar, and every voice of fear is a fluid, changing event that has a natural cycle of rising, peaking, and dissolving back into the quiet space from which it came. Your boundaries are not a solid, vitrified stone that must remain unyielding forever. They are made of soft earth that can be moistened and reshaped with a gentler touch. When you try to force your mind into an absolute, non-porous seal to protect yourself from uncertainty. You are not preserving your life, you are simply cutting your spirit off from the natural warmth and healing that is already present around you. You are treating a passing cloud of grief as if it were your permanent identity, forcing your inner world to turn to dust inside a salt-glazed prison. The Buddha was not asking us to reject our soft, fragile human sensitivity. He was showing us how to stop adding a second wound to the first. The first pain is what life brings to our path, the reality that we will experience sudden losses, that relationships will change, and that we will carry the tender memories of times when our trust was broken. That is an inescapable part of being an interconnected creature in a shifting universe. We cannot always control the first pain. We cannot prevent the winter frost from arriving in the orchard. But the second pain is the massive, suffocating layer of chronic isolation and self-judgment we construct when our own mind insists that we must exile ourselves from the human current because of those wounds. The cold, numb stillness in your chest, the sudden impulse to run away from love, the heavy exhaustion of trying to appear completely self-contained, this is the second wound. We inflict it upon ourselves every time we tighten the seal, believing that we must remain unreached until the world becomes perfectly safe. In a moment, this story will show us how to bring this ancient understanding directly into the physical sensations currently resting in your own body. We will move into a quiet internal practice where we can begin to experience this softening firsthand, learning how to let the tightest walls relax without any pressure to become perfectly healed tonight. But before we begin that practice, let your shoulders drop a fraction deeper into the pillow, letting go of the need to guard the fortress as we continue. If it feels right to you in this quiet moment, let your awareness slide gently away from the world of words, memories, and obligations, shifting downward into the immediate physical reality of your body as it rests here in the dark. There is absolutely no need to alter your posture, to sit up in a rigid stance of formal meditation, or to try and manufacture a state of perfect stillness to touch a deep sense of peace. Whether you are lying flat upon your back, letting your arms fall loose at your sides, or curled softly onto your side, with your hands gathered near your chest, your body is already occupying its own perfect space. If it feels comfortable, you might try placing one palm flat against the center of your chest, right where that heavy, numb stillness of emotional self-exile tends to settle during the day, or perhaps simply allow your fingers to uncurl, completely empty and heavy against the sheets. Nothing is being demanded of you right now. No one is monitoring your progress, and there is no standard of deep relaxation that you are required to achieve before the morning comes. Even if your mind is still producing a rapid, restless current of anxious thoughts, simply being aware of that movement without judging yourself, for it is already a profound act of wisdom. Take a slow, unhurried breath in through your nose, simply noticing the cool, clean quality of the night air as it filters down to meet the heavy stillness within your chest. And when you are ready, let that breath slip out through your lips with a long, soft, unrestricted sigh, letting your abdomen drop and your shoulders settle deeply into the bed. There is no need to count the seconds or force your lungs to mimic an artificial rhythm. Let your body breathe itself at its own natural pace. Observe how the breath functions as a quiet, steady tide that knows exactly how to flow and ebb without a single conscious command from your intellect. For just this evening, you have permission to resign from your post as the permanent guard of your own heart. You can step down from the exhausting labor of maintaining an invisible glass wall between yourself and the world, and allow the heavy, dependable surface beneath you to take over the massive work of holding your weight. Perhaps you can bring your attention to the specific pockets of bracing that sit within your throat, your shoulders, and the small spaces between your eyes, the very places where you have been holding the tight boundaries of your daily self-protection. If you feel a lingering chill or a tight iron-like knot of concentration there, imagine a cool, soft shadow gently passing over your skin, soothing the muscles and inviting the tissues to widen. Let that wave of ease travel downward into your face. So many of our hidden anxieties and our historical habits of emotional retreat find a physical home in the way we lock our jaws when we are trying to appear perfectly self-contained to those around us. If it feels right, let your teeth separate by just a tiny, weightless space. Allow your tongue to drop away from the roof of your mouth and let your lower jaw hang loose and completely unhinged. Notice how that single pocket of physical softening instantly radiates a deep sense of release down the sides of your neck, letting your shoulders drop a fraction deeper into the pillow. As you lie here in the dim, protective cradle of the night, allow your awareness to notice just one specific thought, a particular relationship dynamic, or a recurring memory of betrayal that has been repeatedly asking for your attention today. You do not need to go searching for the deepest or most painful wound in your history. Simply look at whatever quiet shadow is currently hovering at the very surface of your mind. It might be a message you left unread because closeness felt too overwhelming, a friend whose genuine care you are preparing to push away, or a heavy, nameless anxiety that you must keep hidden so that others do not see your vulnerability. Do not try to push this thought away, do not try to solve it, and do not criticize yourself for carrying it into the dark. We are not here to violently tear down your defenses. We are simply here to observe them with a soft, spacious curiosity. In the quiet theater of your imagination, look at this specific habit of self-exile through the lens of our master potter's storehouse. See your defensive pattern not as a permanent failure of your character, but as a heavy, salt-glazed stoneware preservation jar resting in the dark corners of your mind. Recognize the thick, vitrified mineral walls you have spent years thickening, and notice the unyielding clay lid sealed shut with the dense wax of absolute self-reliance. Sense the cold, stagnant dryness that this pattern creates within your chest, that silent isolation of the interior air, constantly cut off from the living moisture of the world out of a desperate desire to avoid being shattered again. For years, your mind has believed that maintaining this absolute seal was the only way to ensure your survival, mistaking an exhausting, lonely prison for genuine safety. Without any rush, and without forcing any sudden emotional breakthrough or dramatic catharsis, imagine your internal awareness gently reaching out to rest against the surface of that heavy jar. You are not trying to take up an iron wedge or a wooden mallet to strike the lid as Yuji did, and you are not demanding that your heart become instantly open and exposed. You are simply choosing to sit with the jar in the quiet darkness, letting the warmth of your non-judgmental attention rest against the hardened wax. Even noticing the presence of the wall is enough to begin a profound, subtle shift within your spirit. In a moment, this journey will take us higher into the mountain passes to see how a heart learns to step fully into the world without losing its grounding. But right now, stay with this changing image in the dark. Watch what happens as the internal pressure to protect yourself begins to relax. The dense, stubborn wax around the rim of the jar does not need to be broken by force. Under the gentle, accepting warmth of your slow breathing, it naturally begins to soften, turning fluid and transparent. Imagine a tiny, weightless hairline fracture opening along the seam of the unyielding clay lid. It is a crack of pure grace, requiring no effort from your intellect. Through that microscopic opening, the dry, stagnant air that has been trapped inside the vessel for winters begins to shift. A single cool breath of the night air slips inside, carrying with it the living, gentle moisture of the changing season outside. The interior of the jar is no longer a sterile vault cut off from the universe. It is beginning to breathe in unison with the room around you. The absolute seal has dissolved. The boundaries have become beautifully porous, and the space around your heart becomes wide, cool, and entirely at peace. There is absolutely nothing you need to accelerate, fix, or complete tonight. True emotional healing is not a sudden storm that shatters your structure. It is a quiet, patient relaxation of the grip, a gentle willingness to let your inner world breathe without calling your sensitivity a defect. You can return to this soft, unyielding earth whenever you feel the freezing panic in your throat begin to tighten, knowing that even a hairline crack in your defenses is enough to let the living water back in. Your hands are entirely empty, your chest is growing wider, and you do not have to solve the mystery of your relationships before you allow your body to sink into the deep, unburdened quiet of the evening. The deep awareness of the resting, cracked seal stayed with UG like a quiet shadow, yet an old habit that has spent a lifetime pulling itself into tight, defensive knots does not dissolve under the light of a single autumn moon. As the season shifted from late autumn into the sharp, biting dampness of a mountain winter, the mountain passes became entirely choked with frozen mud, and a heavy, relentless mist began to hang over the ridges, threatening to rot the wood of the lower kilns. It was during this freezing, grey season that an unexpected letter arrived from the village council down in the valley. The elders had chosen Yuji to craft a massive collection of ceremonial bowls for the upcoming spring festival, a task of immense community importance that would require him to descend from his isolated orchard and work directly among the people he had spent years avoiding. The moment the request was placed in his hands, the old, familiar panic flared up in Yuji's chest like a sudden flash of cold lightning. Instead of feeling honored, he felt an overwhelming, suffocating terror. The voice of his emotional self-exile roared back to life, whispering that this was the ultimate danger, that he would inevitably be hurt again, and that his hard-earned safety would be completely shattered if he let these people near his heart. Driven by the frantic urge to escape this perceived threat, Yuji did not begin the work, and he did not descend to the village. Instead, he packed his few basic tools in a small hemp sack, stepped out into the freezing midnight drizzle, and fled upward toward the highest, most barren peaks of the mountain, determined to exile himself even deeper into the wilderness before anyone could break through his remaining walls. He walked for hours through the blinding dark fog, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, his hands frozen stiff within his sleeves. His body was hunched tight, his shoulders hoisted high to guard his chest against the biting wind, his mind replaying every past betrayal and every moment of relational pain he had ever endured. He was running on the raw, frantic energy of self-preservation, choosing a cold, desolate isolation over the terrifying vulnerability of being seen. By the time the misty dawn began to break over the high ridges, Yuji was completely exhausted, his boots soaked through and his spirit utterly spent. Seeing a faint, crumbling stone structure through the sheets of mountain mist, he stumbled toward the mossy courtyard of an ancient, abandoned high mountain hermitage, collapsing near a forgotten stone well basin at the center of the yard. The air up here was completely still, smelling of wet slate, cold pine needles, and the deep, rich scent of ancient moss. The only movement was the slow, silent drifting of the low clouds through the ruined cedar pillars of the courtyard. Sitting on a low wooden bench near the well, wrapped in a faded indigo robe that had been mended many times at the collar, was Sister Tamio, an elderly, sightless nun who spent her days tending the wild mountain herbs that grew between the stones. She did not look up with alarm when Yuji's heavy footsteps disrupted the silence, and she did not question him about his midnight flight or his mud-splattered clothes. She simply reached out her wrinkled hand, picked up a long-forgotten, unpainted clay roof tile that had fallen from the collapsed roof into the mossy stone whelbsin years ago, and held it out gently in the space between them. The roof tile was completely wet, its raw red clay darkened by years of being fully submerged in the cold water of the well. It carried no protective salt-glazed coating and no vitrified shine. Yet, despite having no shield against the dampness, its structure was perfectly solid, its edges smooth, and its surface covered in a beautiful, soft cushion of living green moss that thrived in the constant moisture. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the way a shrinking heart learns how to stop treating its own protection as a permanent prison. Yuji sank down onto the wet stone steps of the well basin, his head resting against his knees, his chest still heaving from the long, desperate climb. "Sister Tamio," he said, his voice dropping into a tired, hollow whisper that was swallowed by the thick fog. "I have run away again. The village asked for my work, but I cannot go back. My heart is too fragile to be around people. I am like that old sealed jar Jean showed me filled with dust, too afraid of the dampness to ever open up. I thought if I climbed high enough into this wasteland, the walls would finally keep out the pain forever." The elderly, sightless nun did not try to contradict his words, and she did not offer him a quick phrase of empty reassurance. Instead, she gently traced the soft, velvety texture of the green moss growing on the wet clay tile with her fingertips, her face completely serene in the grey morning light. "Look at this tile, Yuji," Sister Tamio said, her voice slow, rhythmic, and entirely unhurried, sounding like the steady dripping of mist from the pine needles above. "This clay was never fired in a high-temperature kiln to become glass. It was never coated in a salt glaze to keep out the storm. It was built to sit on a roof, exposed to every downpour, every winter frost, and every changing wind. And when the old timbers rotted, it fell directly into the deep water of this stone well, where it has lived submerged for more winters than I can remember." She paused, letting the cold mountain silence breathe between them for several long moments before she spoke again. "The weavers and the potters down in the valley would tell you that a tile left in the water is ruined," she continued softly, placing the wet tile back into the palm of Yuji's hand. "They would think that without a glass shield, the damp earth would simply dissolve into mud and wash away. But feel the weight of it. The clay has not dissolved. It has not lost its strength. Because it was allowed to be porous, because it never resisted the water, it didn't fight the well. Instead, it simply drank the moisture until it was completely full, and then it allowed the moss to grow across its skin. It became a home for something alive, precisely because it did not try to turn itself into an impenetrable stone." Sister Tamio turned her blind eyes toward the vast, misty valley below, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Your mistake, Yuji, is that you confuse isolation with safety, and you confuse numbness with strength. When the village offered you connection, your mind panicked because you have spent your whole life using your past heartbreak as a shield to keep the world away. You believe that if you let people touch your life, you will dissolve like raw mud in a flood. So you run up the mountain, sabotaging your own relationships, because a cold exile feels less terrifying than the uncertainty of being loved, but your heart was never meant to be a vitrified, salt-glazed vault. You do not need to choose between a terrifying vulnerability that breaks you and a cold wall that starves you. You can be like this wet tile. You can let the human current move through your life, absorbing the dampness of grief and joy alike, knowing that the spacious awareness within you can hold it all without shattering. Yuji sat perfectly still on the stone steps, the damp morning fog gathering in tiny silver beads upon his hair. A profound, weightless wave of transformation moved through his chest, softening the heavy, frozen knot that had driven him up the mountain trail. He looked down at the unpainted clay tile resting in his hands, feeling its cool, moist weight, and for the first time, he understood the profound error of his defensive design. He had been treating his sensitivity as a fatal flaw that required an iron boundary, using his self-exile to prove his own fearful stories true. He did not achieve a state of sudden magical perfection in that hour, and he did not instantly lose his fear of being hurt by the world below. But right there, in the quiet courtyard of the ruined hermitage, Yuji made one small, subtle shift in the way he related to his own suffering. He took a long, slow, unbraced breath, letting his chest expand fully into the foggy air without trying to push the chill away. He did not try to force his anxiety to vanish, and he did not pretend that his past heartbreak had never happened. Instead, he reached down and gently lowered the wet clay tile back into the mossy water of the stone well basin, letting it settle quietly into the depths where it belonged. He chose to stop chasing an immediate answer to his loneliness. He chose to sit with the uncertainty of returning to the village, stopping the old habit of treating his fearful, defensive thoughts as the absolute truth of his reality. He forgave himself for running into the night, without pretending the panic had not occurred. Sister Tamio stood up slowly, her bamboo basket balanced against her hip, and began to move quietly among the wild herbs, leaving Yuji to sit alone in the vast, peaceful grayness of the dawn. The mist continued to drift through the ancient courtyard, but inside Yuji's chest, the frantic need to build an unyielding fortress had finally ceased. The young potter stood up, turned his face back toward the trail that led down into the valley, his body growing remarkably grounded, his breathing becoming regular and quiet, finally permitting himself to be a porous creature of earth who was already safe enough to walk among the living. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. Let the image of that high mountain well basin and the wet clay tile settle deeply into your own awareness now, allowing the cool morning mist to wash away the last remaining layers of your own internal strain. You do not have to build a flawless, ironclad heart to step back into your life tomorrow. You can allow your rigid boundaries to soften, letting your spirit imitate the porous clay that remains completely solid, even when it is fully submerged in the changing currents of the world, as we prepare to look deeper into the movements of our own minds. When we look deeply into the hidden clockwork of our own suffering, we begin to see that this persistent habit of emotional self-exile is not an accidental malfunction of the mind. It is a slow, meticulously constructed fortress built by a heart that has learned to treat vulnerability as a mortal hazard. At some point along your journey, you encountered a winter that felt entirely too cold to bear. You experienced a moment where the ground beneath your feet gave way, where the people you trusted could not hold your weight, or where a sudden, devastating storm of loss left you feeling completely stripped of your dignity. In response to that raw, unmoored terror, your mind stepped forward to perform an act of desperate heroism. It decided that if the outside world was too unpredictable and dangerous, it would simply build an impenetrable vault. It resolved to glaze over your softest places, seal the lid with the dense wax of absolute self-reliance, and ensure that nothing could ever reach you again. But notice the profound internal friction that this solitary fortress creates within your physical body right now. Have you ever noticed that the more energy you spend trying to appear completely unbroken, polite, and self-contained, the more hollowed out and fragile you feel underneath? We live under the continuous, exhausting illusion that our isolation is what preserves our safety. The mind constantly whispers that if you allow a single person to see your unpainted, porous edges, or if you confess that you are carrying a deep, quiet emptiness, you will be instantly blindsided and shattered. We begin to use self-judgment and fierce internal vigilance as tools for structural maintenance, believing that if we can anticipate every betrayal, replay every past mistake, and rehearse every future catastrophe, we can prevent life from hurting us again. We punish our own natural longing for connection, hoping that a harder, more vitrified version of ourselves will finally be immune to the changing seasons of the heart. This is the exact psychological mechanism where our protective boundaries begin to calcify into a suffocating prison. You no longer just feel a temporary wave of loneliness, you turn that loneliness into your permanent identity. You look at your life through a cold, grey pane of glass and believe that you are fundamentally meant to live in exile, that you are a separate, disconnected object destined to stay dry and empty, while the rest of the world undergoes a moving thaw. We become so attached to our armor that we treat the possibility of closeness not as an invitation to heal, but as a terrifying emergency that we must flee. We flee up the mountain into the dark, wet fog of our own overthinking, preferring the predictable ache of an isolated wasteland to the beautiful, uncertain risk of being known. We confuse the numb stillness in our chest with genuine spiritual peace, forgetting that a heart that cannot breathe with the world is a heart that is quietly turning to dust. One of the great, liberating insights of the Buddha was the clear, compassionate distinction between the natural weight of human life and the immense artificial suffering our own minds add to it. He pointed out that our existence is composed of two entirely separate layers. The first layer consists of the basic, inescapable conditions of being a soft, interconnected creature in a shifting universe, the reality that we will experience sudden losses, that relationships will naturally change, and that our trust will sometimes be tested by the frailties of others. This is what Buddhist wisdom calls the first pain. It is like the cold midnight rain that falls upon the plum orchard, or the heavy stones that line the mountain path. It is a natural condition of a changing world, fluid, temporary, and entirely beyond our separate, individual control. We cannot freeze the river to keep it from moving, and we cannot guarantee that a winter frost will never arrive to nip the blossoms. The second layer is what our own mind constructs around that initial winter. It is the invisible, rigid resistance that insists, "I must never let the dampness touch me again." It is the desperate silent demand that says we must vitrify our boundaries, seal our lids with wax, and permanently exile ourselves from the human current to ensure we are never wounded twice. This second layer, this frozen fortress of chronic solitude and self-blame, is what transforms a passing season of grief into a lifetime of stagnant desolation. We cannot always control the first pain, we cannot undo the losses of our past, and we cannot force the world to become perfectly safe before tomorrow morning. But the Buddha illuminated a beautiful, comforting truth. We possess the sacred, quiet capacity to stop feeding the second pain. We can learn to stop treating our own vulnerability as a defect that must be hidden away in a salt-glazed vault. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal, stepping out of the realm of parables and entering the immediate physical sensations currently resting in your own body. Think of how this invisible mechanism is operating within the quiet space of your room right now. As you lie awake in the dark, the first layer of your experience may simply be the reality that your chest feels heavy, or that your throat carries the tight residue of an old, unexpressed loneliness. That is a natural, tender condition of a tired nervous system that has been holding its guard for too long. But notice how quickly the second layer arrives, the anxious rehearsal of how you will protect yourself tomorrow. The constant comparison of your isolated life to the connected lives of others, and the heavy judgment that tells you that you are too broken to ever belong. Notice that the silence of the night is not what is causing your heart to constrict. It is your resistance to your own sensitivity that is creating the cold wall. True peace is not the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a magical, static state where you will never encounter an overwhelming emotion, a shifting relationship, or a painful loss again. If you are waiting for your outer life to become completely predictable, or for everyone around you to become perfectly safe, before you give your own chest permission to soften, you will be trapped behind your glass pane forever. Peace is not an unyielding stoneware jar that survives the storm by remaining completely empty and dry inside. Peace is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the capacity to function like that unpainted clay roof tile, resting in the depths of the mossy well basin, to allow your fibers to be porous, to let the moisture of life enter your veins, and to recognize that your true resilience lives in your willingness to flow with the universe, not in your isolation from it. What happens within your spirit when you stop treating the thought that you are fundamentally broken as an absolute command to run away into exile? What happens when a wave of heavy sadness or fear arises in your chest, and instead of chipping away at your own structure with self-judgment, you simply sit with it with a soft, spacious curiosity? In that single moment of recognition, the cold, vitrified architecture of your defense naturally begins to warm. You are no longer the lonely potter trapped in a frozen storehouse, and you are no longer the vessel starving within its own airtight seal. You become the vast, quiet container that can safely hold both the changing weather of the world and the tender memories of your past without being destroyed by them. You become the quiet observer of the wall, and because you are the spacious awareness that holds the boundary can no longer define your worth. In a moment, this wisdom will come even closer to the specific choices, digital screens, and unspoken pressures you encounter when you open your eyes tomorrow morning. We will see how this perspective of the porous clay tile and the open jar applies directly to the modern rhythms of your everyday life, to the heavy silences in your relationships, the fear of being exposed as imperfect, and the profound exhaustion of pretending to be completely self-contained. But as we prepare to bring this teaching home to your daily path, remember that there is absolutely no breakthrough you need to force tonight. Let the cadence of these truths settle into your mind like evening mist, sinking into the dry moss of the mountain forest, leaving your heart a little wider, a little softer, and completely permitted to drop its guard as we rest. Now, let this ancient awareness of the unpainted clay roof tile and the salt-glazed stoneware jar drift slowly down from the remote mountain hermitage, entering the exact rooms, the glowing digital screens, and the unspoken pressures of your modern, everyday life. The weathered kilns and the mossy stone well basins are not merely symbols from a distant historical world. They represent the precise emotional landscapes operating within your body. When you look at your phone in the early hours of the morning, or when you lay it face down on the nightstand at the end of an exhausting day, we do not listen to these truths to escape our contemporary reality, but to learn how to navigate its relentless, hyper-connected demands without allowing our inner fibers to wither from a lack of breath. Think of how frequently you find yourself twisting into that tight, self-sabotaging pattern of exile during a normal afternoon. Perhaps it happens when you are sitting at a crowded dinner table or participating in a modern workplace meeting, suddenly feeling a profound, invisible distance between yourself and everyone else in the room. You look around at the expressions of those nearby, and an old, cold panic flares up in your chest. The mind immediately whispers that you do not truly belong, that you are a separate, defective object destined to remain misunderstood, and that if anyone sees your unpolished, porous edges, they will instantly reject you. To defend against this imaginary threat, you automatically tighten your throat, shorten your breath, and put on a bright, capable smile while feeling incredibly heavy and isolated inside. You become like that salt-glazed jar, frantically thickening your boundaries and hiding your softest places behind a glass mask of absolute self-reliance just to remain unreached and safe. Maybe you recognize this automatic emotional retreat when you find yourself waiting for a specific text message or an expression of reassurance from someone whose opinion holds a heavy weight over your heart. When the screen remains blank, or when a response feels slightly brief, Your mind treats the silence as an absolute emergency. To protect yourself from the agony of perceived abandonment, your intellect begins to spin complex, agonizing scenarios. It replays old mistakes, analyzes every word you spoke, and fiercely rehearses how you will withdraw from the relationship before the other person can leave you. You check your device every few minutes for reassurance, demanding that a single notification act as an iron lid to secure your peace. But notice the internal paradox. The validation you seek from the outside cannot dissolve the old habit of self-exile inside your core. You are trying to force the external world to become perfectly safe and predictable before you will give your own heart permission to breathe in unison with another human being. Slowly comes stepping out of the realm of parables and into the quiet spaces of your regular routine. Tomorrow, when you step back into the noise of the daylight world, you do not have to perform perfectly, and you do not have to fix every tangle in your history before you are allowed to be happy. True peace is not practiced by running away into a mountain storm. It is cultivated in the very small, poetic moments of your ordinary hours. It begins when you realize that you can care deeply about your life, your relationships, and your work without gripping their outcomes so fiercely that your inner world begins to turn to dust from the strain. When an unexpected wave of loneliness strikes your chest, or when you feel the sudden impulse to leave a message unread because closeness feels too overwhelming, you can choose to do what the young potter did near the well basin. You can stop. You can take a long, slow breath before you answer a demanding message, before you check your phone for reassurance, or before you pull back into your shell. A single, unhurried breath taken in the middle of a frantic moment is a form of supreme spiritual wisdom. In that tiny, sacred gap, you are refusing to strike your own heart with a second wound. You are acknowledging the first pain, the reality that the fear is real, that the old scar is tender, and that your body feels incredibly vulnerable. But you are refusing to turn that temporary confusion into a permanent verdict about your soul. You are remembering that not every self-critical thought deserves your total obedience, and not every uncomfortable feeling is a command that you must follow. Your thoughts are merely shifting clouds moving across the wide sky of your awareness. They are not the sky itself. You can care deeply without gripping tightly, and you can act without forcing the universe to match your timeline. If you find yourself wanting to rest at the end of a long week, but feel a heavy blanket of guilt settling over you, whisper to your own mind that you do not need to earn your right to breathe. The unpainted clay tile does not need to be fired into glass to hold its absolute value. Its strength is found in its fundamental nature, not in its isolation. You can rest without earning it, and you can let go of the extra struggle without disappearing from the fabric of the world. Tonight, as you lie in the protective sanctuary of this quiet room, remind your tired mind that the day you left behind is completely finished. The conversations have reached their natural conclusions. The screens have gone dark. The tasks have taken their current shapes. There is absolutely nothing you can fix, rewrite, or secure between this hour and the dawn. The world is fully capable of turning its massive weight without your constant vigilant surveillance. You can let the heavy lid of your self-protection drop, allowing the parched, compressed foundations of your spirit to open up to the deep, cool stillness of the night. Your only calling in this moment is to let your chest widen, to let your jaw become loose, and to permit your whole body to sink into the unburdened, unguided current of the evening. In a moment, our journey will bring us to the final, stillest part of the night, where the unyielding stonewares and the cold glass walls dissolve completely into the quiet landscape of your sleep. You do not need to memorize these lessons, and you do not need to carry the weight of the pottery into your dreams. Just let your awareness become as soft and spacious as the night air, letting the demands of the day fade away like a harmless echo in the midnight forest as we prepare to close our eyes. The great, silent mist that drifted through the high mountain hermitage has finally settled completely over the quiet valley below, draping the bare trees and the mossy stones in a soft, seamless blanket of silver grey. Inside this room, the shadows have grown long and remarkably still, resting across the corners of your bed like unpolished clay that has no shape to maintain, no expectations to fulfill, and no judgments to offer. Let your physical frame sink entirely into the dense, dark support of the mattress beneath you, letting go of the very last effort required to hold yourself separate from the world. Your limbs are taking on a calm, unbothered weight now, mimicking the deep, steady density of that ancient clay roof tile resting at the bottom of the quiet well basin. There is no path you need to walk tonight, no performance you need to evaluate, and no protective fortress you are required to maintain in the dark. The daylight world has completely closed its eyes to all demands, and you are fully permitted to close your eyes too, letting your awareness slide away from the shore of your worries like water seeping into a porous stone, with each quiet breath that moves behind your ribs. Notice how the internal rhythm of your mind is beginning to slow down, shifting from a sharp, restless vibration into a deep, low, spacious stillness. Your exhalations are becoming long, soft, and entirely unrestricted, matching the slow, gentle dripping of the evening condensation from the eaves of the old storehouse. You do not need to manage the breathing or try to force your lungs into an artificial calm. Simply allow your body to breathe itself in its own private, natural cadence. The tight, defensive wall that has been bracing your chest all through the long day is completely cooling down now, releasing its frozen tension into the dark. Let your eyelids become immensely heavy, as if they were made of raw, damp velvet, dropping shut over your eyes with a beautiful final weight that no longer wishes to look for hidden dangers or old rejections. The frantic, vitrified fortress you have been holding inside your mind is completely resting tonight. Think of that tireless internal jar that has spent winters keeping its lid sealed with dense wax, trying to protect its interior by remaining dry, empty, and unreached. Every single hairline crack has been accepted, and the unyielding mineral glaze has turned back into soft, receptive earth. Your spirit is entirely porous now. It no longer pulls back from the presence of stillness. It no longer treats a gesture of warmth as an emergency to flee from, and it no longer tries to apologize for taking up space on this earth. You are resting flat in the vast protective cradle of the evening, allowed to be wet, allowed to be messy, and allowed to let your softest vulnerabilities simply exist without calling them a defect. The heavy hemp sack has been dropped, the village requests have been laid down, and the space within your throat has become wide, cool, and entirely at peace. You have complete permission to stop solving your life for tonight, the endless calculations, the anxious rehearsal of tomorrow's encounters, the replaying of past heartbreaks, and the exhausting habit of trying to protect yourself through permanent self-exile. All of them can be left on the threshold of this hour, dissolving harmlessly into the dark mist. There is absolutely nothing you can fix, rewrite, or secure between this silent moment and the rising of the sun. The universe is vast enough, dark enough, and compassionate enough to hold all of your unpainted, unpolished pieces while you sleep, without requiring your constant, white-knuckled surveillance. You do not have to earn your place in this room by becoming an invulnerable stone before your head touches the pillow. You are allowed to be a tired human being who has stopped running from their own sensitivity, letting the day wind down into nothingness without calling your need for connection a flaw. A profound, velvety feeling of returning home is settling into the very core of your body, melting away that cold, glass-like boundary that has kept your spirit in exile for so long. It is the deep, Quiet realization that the emotional safety you have been searching for through absolute isolation was never a fortress to be built by an armored mind. It is the fundamental nature of the porous clay itself, which remains completely solid, strong and grounded, even when it is fully submerged in the cold water of the well. You do not need to freeze yourself to survive the winter. Like the raw clay tile absorbing the gentle moisture of the spring dawn, you can let your boundaries soften, you can let the silence enter your veins, and you can trust that you are already whole within the open space of your own awareness. You are the vast, quiet container that witnesses the wall, not the fortress itself. You are the timeless peace that remains untouched by the old stories of betrayal. Let the words and the images of the mountain pottery workshop fade away entirely now, dissolving like a wisp of smoke from a cooled charcoal brazier into the quiet atmosphere of your room. You do not need to remember the lessons, you do not need to analyze the parables, and you do not need to carry a single concept into your dreams. Let your mind become as empty, as still, and as beautifully unguided as the fog drifting through the ancient ruined pillars. Your breathing is nothing more than a faint, rhythmic murmur in the silence. A gentle wave of life that is slowly, surely carrying you deeper into the infinite, peaceful currents of an uncompromised sleep. The room is still, the blanket is warm, and your heart is completely unsealed, floating weightlessly into the deep, welcoming sanctuary of your rest. And if the true safety you have been trying to protect by locking the door was never something the world could take from you, but the very awareness that is breathing here in the dark,